I want to ask you a question about work. So you describe work as a means of contribution. And what I enjoy in your approach to all arenas of life is that whatever we're seeing is a manifestation of a deeper reality or consciousness. So on the surface we get married, but behind that there's something else, and on the surface we have homes, but there's the core, kind of the ground zero of homes, family, birth, meaning, etc. So when you speak about work and different models of work, you describe our drive to work as being connected to our desire for meaning. And part of the reason that it's so pleasurable and that we're compelled to work is because we want to make a contribution. I'm wondering if people might not look at that as some kind of glorification of something they have to do, Torah framing labor as a means of controlling the masses. And the other aspect, that's more from a political perspective, but the other
You're
aspect...
You're a socialist at heart, right?
Well, somewhere, I grew up in South Africa, and it just hurt too much to see people, and there was such language. You could see how language was continuously manipulated to control the masses, and that was really painful to me. There was no television in South Africa till I turned 12, because people knew, I think the government knew, that when you put discourse out there in the public, it's going to undermine political control. So you come and speak about work and it sounds wonderful and noble, and I'm thinking, come on, Simon, that's like spiritual language to maintain power in the hands of a few and get the masses to be working their butts off.
Okay, I'm glad we got this South African disclaimer out of the way, because that definitely it's a great question, but it's important to understand cultural upbringing. I didn't grow up in South Africa. I grew up in the United States, where what your description of work is foreign to me. I mean, I've read about slave labor.
Slave labor. Work was dirty in some way, and so was money. And
do you know something?
Success.
And as Jews, work was dirty. You know where? In Egypt.
In Egypt.
Slave labor. Now, in the lesson on work, I address the different models for work in history. Because if you really begin, you could quote the Bible. The Bible says, once they sinned, "B'zeis hapecha techa lechem," from the sweat of your brow will you earn your bread. The genesis and creation of work as being a curse or being a punishment. And that is actually how it's taken literally by many Christian scholars, that work is a curse. In the times of the Romans and the Greeks, work and labor was for the inferior people. Even Maimonides quotes it somewhat, like tailors and shoemakers were all seen as servants of the elite. The elite was the prince philosopher.
Right, the proletariat is supporting the luxurious life of an elite.
And work was seen as literally, as the Bible says it, a curse for menial labor. That was some of the early versions of work. Later in Christianity, just to briefly give you the history, work became a necessary evil, somewhat like sexuality. That's a necessary evil. But it's not pure evil. We can glorify or we can elevate work. But they're still working with a model that it's rather, a really spiritual person should just be sitting at the books and involved in meditation and philosophy and virtue and whatever that means. We won't get into whether that's even possible, but let's say it is. But since we do work and we do have to be thrifty and we do have to support ourselves, let's elevate it. And we elevate it through virtue, through charity. And there are different models of how work...
Look, we have our own model of that in
I'm getting to that.
Where Yisachar and Zvulun, two brothers, where one tribe supports another.
Partners, exactly. One is the scholar, one is the worker. But let me go forward. Then, of course, there's the birth of capitalism, which is an outgrowth, by the way, of Calvinism, the Protestant work ethic, but taken to a further extreme, that the individual greed, even for success, is the driving force of the economy. And how is that going to be tempered? It was a problem. When you read Adam Smith, you read about capitalism, you read it. The philosophers had a problem. How will that be tempered? In a strange way, the socialism and Marxism of Marx in a way, created the unions and one of the labor laws that has tamed capitalism. Pure capitalism doesn't really exist today. And many will, of course,
many people complain about that because it's stifling growth and
but all
creativity.
I mean, you have all these stories about the what was that, the fire in the early 20th century that changed labor laws. I mean, there was slave labor in the United States, besides the blacks. The women and children were made to work. All those rules came as a result of socialism. But bottom line is they're interestingly all working with symptoms. No one really got to the heart of work. I find that only in Judaism it's addressed in the most powerful way. And I came to discover it actually, interestingly, when the Rebbe turned 70 years old, so he received many letters that he should retire. Look how much he's achieved. This is 1972. And how much he's achieved. And he spoke about it publicly. He writes that, he speaks publicly. He says, I've received letters and information and suggestions. It's time for you to slow down and look how much you've accomplished and so on. And he was very adamant in that talk. It's the birthday talk, Yud Aleph Nisan, 11th of Nisan in 1972. And then he talks about, he says, first of all, age is not dependent on the passport. It's dependent on the attitude. And then he, more importantly, cites the verse, Adam la'amal yivalad. A person was created to work. So the Talmud says there are three types interpretations in that work. There's physical labor. There's amal tefillah, prayer, the work of prayer, is sometimes referred to as work, emotional work, let's call it that. And then there's intellectual work called amal Torah, study. They're all work. But the bottom line is, most situations, except a few rare occasions like Rosh Hashanah Bar Yochai or others, work entailed all three, and a balance.
Well, I guess we have blue-collar workers and white-collar, and that's kind
in
of
a
what
way,
you're talking
right. But this is when he addressed this issue in a very unbelievable, powerful way. The lesson is based on this central point. And he said, well, let's analyze this. Why? Why is a man created to work? What would be wrong if we weren't created to work? Because you see, this means that it's not a curse, it's a divine mandate. Not as the Christians or others interpreted work. The sweat of the brow is referring to something else. We'll get to that in a moment. But the work itself, God created human being to work, and the Rebbe said there's no retirement from life. Because life is equated and equals to work and producing, and there's no such thing as retirement from that. There may be changes in your life cycles and spaces when and how much you work and how you produce. But the idea of retiring from life for the Rebbe was anathema. And here's what he said. He said that, so initially you can say is when a person works through their own effort, the Talmud says a person has more pleasure from $1 you make on your own than from 9 that you receive as a gift. But the Rebbe, in his inimitable way, challenged that even. He says, okay, that's human nature, but who created human nature that way? Why didn't God create us in a way that you can get a gift and not feel bad about it? Not feel that you got a gift. Feel the same satisfaction.
Feel gratified by receiving it in the same way as earning.
And the Rebbe, this is one of the innovations and chidushim, as we call it, of the Rebbe, was that God wanted us to be like God, to be producers, givers, not just receivers. So yes, of course he could have created that we should receive and feel good about it, but we ultimately would not be producers. We would not be creating something. So work becomes essentially the most godlike thing we can do when we produce. And yes, that's why we have more pleasure in $1 that you produce than 9 that I give you as a gift. Even though you can buy more, purchase more with 9, but there's that qualitative satisfaction that you've produced. You've been godly. Now, this doesn't define what type of work. This can be the most menial labor to the most sophisticated labor. The point is you're put here on this earth, and whatever it is that you're producing, even if you're a wagon driver of the Baal Shem Tov, or not from the Baal Shem Tov, someone simpler, you have a purpose in that. Yes, if you think it in terms of, well, it's not as elegant or sophisticated or glorified as other types of work, but there's something in that role that you can contribute that no person but you can contribute. I'll tell you the story about Alter Rebbe takes one of his greatest scholar disciples and tells him to become a wagon driver for 20 years. Now put yourself in his shoes. He's a scholar, a teacher. Is that the best way to use my 20 years of my life? Or even 1 year, for 5 minutes. But the Rebbe saw his purpose. And the end of the story was that he helped save a life through that. Right. Now, I'm not suggesting everyone suddenly become wagon drivers, but sometimes divine providence leads you to something. So you could either be miserable and say, you know what, I don't want to do this. I want a job that's much more, much higher paying, or much. Divine providence is part of God's way of saying what your mission is. And perhaps your mission is a mystery. And it could be that, yes, if you'll be a cab driver, and you'll say something to a certain person, may have been the whole purpose of why you came.
So, but at some level, would you say?
So, now I want to just say about the manipulation thing.
Yeah.
So of course you can make a case. But what I'm saying is not coming after the fact that some people need us to work. These are, ultimately we're talking about what God wants of us, not what the so-called elite are doing and what they want of us. So I see it as a part of the Torah picture.
I guess in some way, you've been saying it all along, anything can be framed in a positive or negative way, because there have been people in power who have spoken like that about work and enslaved people. This is your mission. These are the peasants, and here is royalty or the aristocracy, and this is your mission. Your mission is to be a menial laborer.
I'm going to digress, but I have to say this because I think it's a good example. When the new technologies began to develop, radio, television, of course today the internet, the Rebbe then agreed they should start teaching Tanya on the radio. And this, and many religious and observant Jews had a problem. They said, on the radio, then the next, who knows what's on the next station? Something completely antithetical, especially television. And the Rebbe said, technology, he wrote this in a note to me. I remember, on a talk that he gave in 1984. And he wrote, technology is a creation of God's. He writes, a koyach adir b'teva, which means an enormous power ingrained, implanted in nature that human beings have tapped. It's not a man-made thing, technology. And he brings the example of gold. That gold was created in order to build a Beis HaMikdash, a temple. At the same time, God put it into this material world and gave us free choice. And then he quotes the Talmud. This is a great Mishnah, which I think is the key here. When one of the philosophers asked Rabbi Akiva, why does God not destroy the sun and the moon? Then we will avoid sun worship, moon worship, idol worship. So God says, V'chi mipnei hashetim Ya'abed Hashem eselameh. Rabbi Akiva says, because of the fools, the shaitim, the idiots or the fools, will God destroy his own universe. So the Tosfos Yontif, who's a commentary on the Mishnah, asks a follow-up question. Why didn't he ask, why doesn't God destroy the fools? So of course the answer is free will. So the point is, obviously, fascists, totalitarian regimes, monarchs, it was all in the name of the good of the people. Communists, Hitler, they all used these arguments that's good for the people, we're doing it for the people. So of course it can be completely abused. But are we going to destroy the principles that God put into place because people abuse them? That's how I look at it. So I'm completely with you. In history, you find a lot of abuse, even today. Even in this so-called free market of capitalism. Look what's going on in the economy today. Manipulation. I have no doubt that there's a conspiracy that the wealthier people want to remain wealthy and they're not interested in anyone else joining in. So of course they're going to use their wealth to suppress, control laws. The whole thing is man-made. So our only salvation really is to say, look, I have a God, and let's not take that so seriously. And then try to maneuver as best as we can in the existing circumstances. Capitalism is far from perfect. I just saw in a letter from the Rebbe, or it was an edited letter, he writes, someone kept writing, democracy, democracy. And the Rebbe kept crossing out democracy and changed it to freedom. I was thinking to myself the same thing. Let's not equate the capitalism and democracy with freedom. Freedom is a true Torah concept. Democracy and capitalism are two human constructs that are trying to use freedom perhaps better than they've ever been done, but they're far from perfect. So I'm with you completely. Of course, you think of it this way. Let's be more personal about it. Bottom line is, how am I not going to be a slave laborer and manipulated by somebody else? That's the key thing. Let us say you're in an environment in South Africa. In South Africa, when the apartheid existed, the people in power, they were the ones that controlled the situation. The laborers couldn't do much about it. But the United States, where you have a little more, you can choose where to work or how to work, but you're going to sometimes have to deal with an abusive boss. And so on. Simon,
people would say you can't choose how to work. Susie Orman has a book. It's called The Courage to Be Rich. And I respect her a lot. I really enjoy what she has to say.
Did she get rich from writing this book?
Yeah, she did.
Okay, it's like the secret.
No, she got rich from really helping people about money, around money. But there's something about that title that rubs me the wrong way. The courage to be rich. That's the American myth.
That's
that
a marketing title. If you ever heard
no,
one.
that is not just a marketing title. That is something that underpins American culture. That somehow, if you are not successful, it's your fault. You just didn't work hard enough, and you didn't believe enough. You didn't buy into the American dream of freedom. So it's not just about courage or saying, yes, you can choose where to work. There are many people who can't choose where to work.
No, 1 second. We have to cover a second half of this lesson. When I was writing the lesson on work, I actually had this struggle because on one hand, which we discussed, the actual thing that you produce, we're not getting into what you produce, the idea that you produce, you can create something that was not there is a contribution, and it's godly. In the sense, God produces, you produce, and that's why you have more pleasure. Fine. But that still doesn't mean that the story is over. We still have a Shabbos. 6 days of the week is a work week, and there's a mitzvah to work. You still have Shabbos, because there's perspective, and I think it's vital to add that component. Because if you don't, then it's not just about transforming work. Because you could then argue, then if the purpose of God is that us to transform our work into something divine, it should be 7 days a week. Why do we have a respite? What about home? What about our children? You know, you can then glorify work to the point and say, I'm doing things godly. I should stay at work all day. So let me say the second half, the story of the Rebbe Rashab, 5th Chabad Rebbe, Chassid, who was a great Chassid of his, later went into business. He went into the galoshes manufacturing business, and he made a lot of money. Before Susie, what's her name, Orman? Okay. And why did he make so much money? Because the streets in Russia were not paved. So you can imagine galoshes saved many a shoe. Okay. Anyway, he got so immersed in his business. One day he comes back and sees the Rebbe. The Rebbe gives one look at him and says in Yiddish, "Ich habe gesehen Fies in Galoshen, aber ich habe keinmal gesehen a Kopf in Galoshen." I've seen feet in galoshes. I've never seen a head in galoshes. So let's make something clear here. At the end of the day, yes, God sent us down to earth, as I said earlier, to be involved in the material world, to work, to transform, to produce. But let's not forget, it's God that sent us. At the end of the day, it's about transforming it into a godly place. It's not an end in itself. Work is not an end in itself. Though it leads us. And we have to always remember, I mentioned it before, al karcha chatachai. You're compelled to go there. Don't get so comfortable there. Because the material world is not our natural place. It's the place for you to achieve the ultimate purpose. But your natural place is to be one with God, and to be a godly person, to be a spiritual person. So I think without that dimension, yes, absolutely, you could be at work and have an oppressive environment. Let's talk practical situations. Abusive bosses, clients, co-workers, competing, backstabbing, the whole climate, and especially bosses who use workers against each other.
Mundanity, being incredibly bored by what you have to do.
And you're in this situation, but you need the money. That's the only way you can survive. So we're not getting into whether that's even correct. Maybe you're trapped by your own habit and you don't think you can get out of it. But let's just, for argument's sake, you really can't get another job right now. This seems to be the right one. But your life is not all there. There's another egg in the basket. You know? Investments means diversify, not just in money, but we put some of the eggs in, I have a home, I have a family, I have a soul. My soul is not oppressed by anybody here. And it's ultimately the Jews, even in the most harshest of circumstances, that was the soul that saved them. Now, I'm not saying that redeems the work. You still have to deal with the work situation. That's why it's important to have this balance, because you're absolutely right. There are people that are right now being oppressed and being manipulated in the workforce. So that's already, how do you deal with that on a case-by-case basis? But for a full picture to be described here, you need to know we have a life of your soul. You better reinforce that, especially if your life outside of it is tough. And then maybe with the strength of the soul, I would rephrase the title that she said, the courage to be rich. No, the courage to be you, to fulfill your purpose in this world. And then once you're emboldened by your soul and you have that strength, I think you can re-enter your work situation and not feel like a victim that much. That's what I meant. And then maybe you could free yourself from that situation. That's how it is. I mean, it's hard to answer.
So through your work, you're imprinting your soul. It's like a soul print that you're kind of embedding into reality. So
there's, when you talk about work in an academic setting, an academic context, work has the purpose of what the Rebbe said, then to be productive is to be godly, and so on. But we're not discussing the circumstances and all the difficulties of work and the environment and so on. So there's the other side, the spiritual side. And then I think when a person has inner strength that comes from the soul, they have a home life, they have a loving relationship at home with a good husband or wife, children, that should be a very strong force that can then re-enter work and look at it again and see, what am I doing? You know, I could tell you personally from experiences that I've done counseling people, very often their work situation becomes overwhelming because the rest of their life isn't working that well as well either. So their whole life is weak. But if they can,
or you know, I think that one kind of downside of success is that people begin to identify themselves with the business persona and lose access.
Exactly. If you ask them, who are you? They will give you their business card. Right. Instead of knowing that who you are and what you do is not the same thing. I wanted to say that just to fill the picture in. When the Torah says that b'zeis hapechad, that after the eating from the tree of knowledge, you will not have to earn your way by the sweat of your brow, the Torah was saying that you're going to have now two worlds, the world of work and the world of your soul. Whereas had you not eaten from the tree of knowledge, you could have la'avdal l'shamra, you could have served in the Garden of Eden. In a material world, but there wouldn't have been the schism between matter and spirit.
But if you look at a different spiritual model, you mentioning the story in the Garden of Eden, what it brings up for me is the biblical model of the sanctuary. That where is our definition of rest on the Sabbath from is from the notion of work, and work is embodied by this paradigm of creating a home for God. So at some level, what I understand you saying is, 6 days a week you building the sanctuary, and on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, you enter into it. You enter into a space of being a real human being as opposed to doing, and that all of our work can be framed in that model in some ways. That's correct.
It's a balance. To put it in more so-called Hasidic terminology or mystical terminology, it comes down to, if the purpose of existence is to transform the material world, in other words, the darkest place, then what's the ultimate role of the more sublime parts of our lives? And which is the means, which is the end? So I think at the end of the day, and using again mystical language, it's like there are the containers and there's the light. There's matter and there's spirit. They're both divine. One cannot exist without the other. They need each other. Think of matter as being the platform, the environment where you need to work, and spirit being the captain of the ship. You know, if matter is on its own, it will veer off in its own narcissistic needs. It needs the soul to direct it, to guide it. At the same time, the soul without the body does not fulfill its purpose. And to create this balance in life is really the formula. But the formula manifests in different ways. There's some people, for example, that can take off a year, a sabbatical, and go to Israel. Let me focus more on my soul. You know, I have enough money right now. Some people can do that. Is that the ultimate purpose, to just sit in a yeshiva? No, even if you're able to. You have to be in the material world and engage it in some way. So it's hard to really give a formula to each individual because it's case by case. You know, how much time should you study a day? An hour? Let's say you have the option to study Torah an hour, a half hour, 2 hours. Should I go study with someone else? You know, so there is the Torah balance of Torah, prayer, and work, and how to balance the three of them. And then each person has to really find, with a good objective mentor, what their balance may be. Shabbos, of course, is a day which is more focused on the spirit. 6 days of the week on the work. You have for example, even the argument between Hillel and Shammai. Shammai, even on Sunday, would prepare and put away food for Shabbos. Hillel's approach was every day you do what you have to do. And on Shabbos, you do Shabbos. On Friday, you prepare for Shabbos. And it's not just a technical disagreement. It's also a spiritual perspective. You know, right, exactly. Is the soul, the spirit of Shabbos, the ultimate purpose? Or is the purpose the material? So really, it's both. And the real truth is, we have to see God as being beyond both of them, and only the fusion of the two creates the full divine experience. That's the bottom line. How that fusion takes place, really, I think, is case by case. Also, what stage you are in your life. Obviously, children are developing the spirit more than they are developing the material world. Adults in the workplace are doing the opposite. But without the balance, none of us could survive. The real question is how you really create your configuration, so to speak. Obviously, there's some of us that our work is so pleasurable and so much connected to spiritual activity.
Right.
I can include myself. I work with people, and so on. It's a blessing. It's a gift. But if divine providence would have led me to something else, I would have to find a different configuration and find equal happiness there. Some are more challenging than others. I always tell people when they make career choices early on in their lives, I say, you have to make a decision. Some people can't work for someone else. But remember, then financial security is up in the air. It's going to be up to you. You have to have the ability to ride through. And, on the other hand, some people need to have that security. And sometimes a few years of that security, then you feel more comfortable to go out. But this comes down to different personalities, and I think the beauty of life is that none of us are the same. And that's perfectly fine, I have no doubt. I recall reading a letter from the Rebbe to a laundromat, a guy who ran a laundromat. You talk about menial labor, okay? How would you feel standing most of the day behind the dry cleaners with even pleasant customers? You say to yourself, why am I on this side? You should stand here and let me come and bring you my clothing, And the Rebbe writes this letter to a guy, I guess, who owned a laundromat or dry cleaners, I'm not really sure. And he says everything in life has a meaning. He gives them the meaning of laundry. And it's amazing.
Wow.
Let me tell you what he says. I'll tell it to you briefly. It's interesting. He says, what's the concept of laundry? It's like this. You buy a new garment, fresh new garment. You wear it once, twice, 3 times. At some point it gets soiled, wrinkled, dirty. At some point you can't even wear it anymore. And you think you could throw it out in the garbage. Comes the laundry concept? No. You bring it to a laundry and they wash it with water, and not just water, warm water. Then mix it with chemicals that get rid of some of the stains and other things. And then afterwards comes out, you put it under a very heavy press, and you press it fresh new. And you can do this many, many times. This is a letter. And the Rebbe says, same with the neshama, the soul. The soul comes down to it, the tahirahi, it's pure. But then life starts wearing you down, and it gets soiled and wrinkled and dirty by all types of life wounded. And you think, okay, that's it. The arrow goes only one way. Too bad. They're no longer a fresh garment. It says, no. We learn from this. You could put your soul, you wash it. Ein mayim ela Torah. Water is compared to knowledge, to Torah. But not cold water, warm water. Warmth is life. Cold is detachment. Chemicals is different mitzvahs. Each mitzvah does a little correction of a soil or something that needs to be enhanced, get rid of a stain, etc. And then Kabbalas oil. You put it under a press, oil, the pressure of accepting an authority greater than yourself, and you get back a tahirihi, a soul that's refreshed. This is a letter the Rebbe writes. Now, I was thinking to myself, practically, what did the guy think after that? It's a nice lesson. But you come to say, but how much can he sustain himself in that? Every day go to work, he still does the hard labor. Maybe he could share this with all his customers, but the point is, it wasn't really only about elevating his work. It was understanding that each of us fulfills a role. And just because a person is a teacher and seems so in a respectable position, is that like so-called, if you have humility, is that superior to another person? In truth it's not. In our perspective it is. We all want to be celebrities. Some people want to be movie stars or sports heroes. That's what's idolized today. Try doing that for a little while. What does that do to the soul?